Hey, what is up everyone, and welcome back to another Recall by Dataiku video. My name is Keith Galley and I'm a data science YouTuber, consultant, and educator. Giving and listening to data-driven presentations has been a big part of my professional career. I've seen my fair share of solid presentations, but I've seen a much larger percentage that were lacking and could be improved. A big component of these presentations are the data visualizations. Good visualizations can make a presentation, and bad ones can break it. Presentation skills and the ability to communicate effectively with data is an invaluable part of almost any role. A solid presentation could lead to a promotion at work, it might secure funding for your startup, or it might simply inspire someone to strive towards an important goal. My objective in this video is to provide you with some tips and tricks to become a more effective communicator in the data world. To do this, we'll first walk through some examples of what to avoid when creating data visualizations. We'll highlight some key takeaways from this and start building up an intuition for what makes a chart strong. I'll showcase some tools that everyone can apply to their visualizations and provide some resources that you can use to continue your learning. Should be a lot of fun. All right, what to avoid. The first thing you want to avoid in your data visualizations is information overload. So what I mean by that is all sorts of things. Just basically, are you trying to cram too much for us to easily process in a single chart? So the first chart is this, which is basically trying to show a flow of people moving in the United States and the home prices in between these places, but there's just too much here for me to process and actually get anything out of this. Quick ways I might improve this is like, first off, just lay this out more similar to what we're expecting. Lay this out on the United States, a map of the United States. I think that would help a lot because I can then have a sense of what this data is. The colors too, is too much contrast, too hard to see these colors. Another example of information overload would be this chart. And really, the issue with this chart, it's about kind of the distribution of countries' usage of water. And I like the idea behind it, but it's just throwing too much at us. There's just too much color, too much breakdown. Where really what we care about is the percentage breakdown of these countries going into these different categories, but because it splits off in this manner, it's hard to just interpret how much of each country's overall water consumption is used in each category. Another issue on the topic of information overload is what is called a spaghetti graph. So you could have something like this, where it's basically line charts that just are trying to plot too many different variables at once, and as a result of that, it's just looks like spaghetti and you can't comprehend anything. And I know that this example might seem pretty obvious that this is really a no-no in data visualization, but even simple examples can get caught up in this spaghetti mess. So here's an example that I think is a bit information overload from the Premier League's Instagram, where you have all these people's goals, and it's just you can't even interpret any of these keys. The goal of this post was just to showcase how well Holland was doing on scoring wise, and it does actually make that clear, but I kind of wish there was a little bit more interpretability with all of this. It just seems kind of silly if you can't obviously read it, why they put all of this. So that's another spaghetti graph. You can even have simpler spaghetti graphs. You don't need many lines to start getting into spaghetti graph territory. Something like this, where it's just 6 countries, population over time, it already just starts blending. The lines start intersecting. The colors aren't, there's not enough contrast, and you just kind of get lost and can't see overall trends as easily. Spaghetti graph really is just when lines start intersecting and you can't really make out overall trends. That's, when you get into the concept of spaghetti graph. The second thing we want to avoid in our graphs is when we don't want to be misleading with our graphs. So that could mean a couple different things. One example would be this visual on people graduating from high school and the fact that there are more than ever under President Obama. So perfectly like valid statistics, but the challenge here is that it looks like the increase is much steeper than it actually is, because the y-axis starts at probably like 70% instead of 0. So the relative differences between these graduation rates is much, much steeper than it should be. So with like axes like this, you always want to start at 0, just so you don't skew the data like is happening in this visualization. So if we were to, fix this one, it would look something like this, where it's like, yeah, it's increasing, but it's much less than that other visual shows. Another way you could be misleading is just like by representing data in a way that we don't kind of expect, that kind of goes against our intuition and against our natural kind of how we'll naturally interpret a graph. So you look at a graph like this and you see gun deaths in Florida, and the big thing that they mark on this graph is in 2005, Florida enacted its Stand Your Ground law, and you're like, wow, like you look at this and you see, wow, like it dropped off seriously, the deaths after that point. But then if you look at the graph a little closer and you look at our axes, it's increasing downwards. So like the highest point is way at the bottom, so like after this act, the gun deaths are actually increasing, even though like the way that this axis is put together, it looks like it's decreasing. So that's another way to be misleading, another thing you want to avoid. A final category that you want to avoid in your data visualizations is just making things hard to read. So that could mean a lot of different things. One first point is that sometimes I see graphs that just have axes that are just too small and the data is too small. Like, use your space effectively, make those axes very clear and visible to read. You don't want people using extra mental processing just to be able to see your visualization. So if you look at a graph like this, you have all this data there, but just everything is quite small, and like you could just utilize the space more effectively. The axes labels are too small and the data lines are too thin for the amount of space that we have. Also, just avoid, another way you don't want to be hard to read is by using graph formats that are just tricky. So like generally pie charts are not great graph choices. Donut charts aren't great graph choices. 3D charts, just because the nature of like seeing 3D on a 2D representation is just hard to interpret. It's just not natural. You can things can be skewed how they shouldn't be. So try to be smart with your graph usage. Generally avoid pie charts. Like, use bar charts instead of pie charts in 99% of cases, I would say. All right, so now that we know some of the common issues to avoid in our data visualizations, how do we fix these things? So let's start with information overload. The first tip that I would recommend is to step your audience one by one through the components of your graph. So if you have let's say, line chart that looks like this, so this is YouTube views over time for my channel. Instead of presenting this entire graph to them and then trying to like talk through it, what's better is to use the graph as a visual aid and really let your audience focus on specific components and use how you design the graph to help you each step of the way. So in this chart, it's hard to read all of this. There's just a lot of information here. It's a lot of cognitive load to look at. But what I could do is just simplify this graph and then start using strategic use of coloring and opacity to like help the audience focus on what's important. So in 2017, I created the channel and there was just slow growth of viewership as a result. In 2018, I started making videos on programming, which led to a pretty sharp increase in views and led to more consistent viewership over time. In 2019, I built on this. I was posting more consistently and views started coming in more consistently and the channel started growing, so new videos got more traction. 2020 led to an overall increase consistent uploads, and the pandemic helped aid overall programming interest and viewership. A lot of people had extra time to learn a new skill. 2021, I was a lot less consistent with uploads, having only 4 in the entire year. But luckily, my previous videos helped keep viewership relatively high, but we saw no further growth. In 2022, we saw an initial increase with a few uploads near the start of the year, but then again, a lack of consistent uploads, along with very little uploads in all of 2021, has led to a decrease in overall monthly viewership. The next tip, and I kind of referenced this in the previous example, but I want to state it clearly, is to strategically use coloring and opacity to highlight what's important. So let's say I was presenting to my team a new dashboard that we built. I could just show the dashboard on, fill the screen with the dashboard and just talk through each component with it all up. But what I worry about in doing that is that audience's attention will drift. They'll look at the different things and not actually hear what I'm saying. So what's better is to kind of show that dashboard in its entirety, but then fade out the things that are not important and just keep clear what you are currently talking about, and maybe even zoom in on that component. So now they have the context of what the overall dashboard looks like, but you've zoomed in on a specific component, and it's easier for you to talk about that specific component and for them to pay attention and take in the information that you're trying to get across. I do want to quickly note that not always are you going to be giving a live presentation, but I think you can try to keep these things in mind so that even in your, the slide decks that you share with your team offline, they can still on their own kind of filter out and focus on what's important each step of the way. So like a line chart like I previously described, instead of reference those notes in line with the same time period that they are relevant to. A final tip to avoid information overload is to utilize the data to ink ratio principle. So this principle was first introduced by Edward Tufte in his book, The Visual Display of Quantitative Data. And the basic premise behind the data to ink ratio is that you should maximize, so in a visualization, you should maximize the amount of data that exists to the amount of ink that you used in your visualization. So if you have all sorts of fluffy extra things, you would have high ink, and that would decrease the overall data to ink ratio. But if you use very little amount of details and ink to display your data, you're increasing the amount of data, you're increasing the importance of what is there. So just a quick example is, let's say I just wanted to compare the populations of the USA to China. Well, in a first pass, maybe I list all sorts of countries in my visualization, but really the data that I'm trying to get across is the relationship of China to the US population-wise. So I don't need all of these countries here. And maybe, I first sort the populations, and then I see, within the top 5, both China and the USA are present. So maybe I just take, let's say 5 countries. So now we're using less ink overall to showcase our data, which in this case is the USA population versus China. And then, because we want to focus on USA and China, we can tweak just their colors and kind of fade out everything in the background to help further emphasize our point. Things like grid lines and the border of our chart are not necessary. They're not providing any new data, so we can remove those. And what we're left with is a graph that has the data that we need, but it uses a low amount of overall ink. All right, next, how do we avoid being misleading with our charts? So I think the most important thing to consider with this issue is just to be honest with yourself. Ask yourself as you're creating visualizations, is this an accurate depiction of the data? Make sure that you're not trying to tweak any axes, you're not trying to skew any sort of results to work more favorably for your case. Note there is a strong difference between being clear and direct and trying to show off a specific component of your data and skewing it and interpreting it falsely. If you're ever not sure about how you're depicting your data, what I recommend is asking a friend or a colleague to hear their thoughts. So maybe present them with the chart and just ask them, hey, what are your thoughts on this? And then you can follow up with more detailed questions as needed. But just make sure that they're not kind of caught off guard, because ultimately you can really easily, if someone catches you trying to skew something, trying to show off something in a non-honest way, that can kind of remove all of your credibility for the rest of the presentation. So it's something you really, really want to be careful to avoid doing. Finally, how do we improve graphs that are just hard to read? So some general tips for this is just make sure you're using the right type of graph for the right problem. Line charts are generally good to show trends over time. Bar charts are good to show differences between categorical variables. Sometimes text with special formatting is enough. So let's say you have two variables you're trying to compare. Maybe you're just trying to show the amount of students that enjoyed some sort of after-school program. Instead of showing a bar chart with 90% of the students enjoying the program and 10% not enjoying the program, what would be more effective is to just showcase this in text and say something like, over 90% of students enjoyed the program. That's going to be more effective than just a bar chart just showing that difference. Another tip to improve charts that are hard to read is to leverage the natural Z pattern that we use when reading. So in English and Latin-based languages, we read left to right. So it's good to kind of model your visualizations in that same format. Have the title on the farthest to the left side. Maybe if you have any sort of subtitle, put that right below. And then the reader can start going, title to the right, subtitle to the right, and then start seeing the visualization and, capture it all that way. And that's very natural to how we read, how we process other information. So it's smart to do that with your visualizations as well. You can do some simple things, make your axes labels bigger, remove grid lines, just remove excess information. I could definitely go on and on about all sorts of different things you could do to improve your visualizations, but hopefully these are some basic premises that you can leverage and apply them to your charts, your graphs as needed to really make your presentations more effective. If you have additional thoughts on specific practices that are good to implement in your data visualizations, I'd definitely be interested in hearing those in the comments section below. In preparing for this lecture, I consulted a few different sources to help organize my thoughts. A great book on creating powerful visualizations is Storytelling with Data by Cole Nussbaumer-Knaflic. Cole was an early and important member of the people analytics team at Google, where she was known to be able to distill some of the messiest of messages into concise, data-driven presentations. She would host training sessions breaking down a lot of the skills that she used, and ultimately these sessions led to her writing this book. Shout out to fellow YouTuber Shashank Kalanithi for introducing me to this book. Another great resource is the How to Speak lecture by the late Professor Patrick Winston. When I was a student at MIT, Professor Winston was probably the best teacher that I had. While I took 2 of his artificial intelligence classes, what I learned most from Professor Winston was how to be an effective communicator. A lot of the lessons that I learned from him are brilliantly condensed into this 1-hour How to Speak lecture. I'll make sure to link both of these resources in the description. Knowing about the concepts of data visualization is great, but it is important to have a tool that you can utilize to create these visualizations. If you know any of the other content that I've made, then you know that I'm a huge fan of the Python programming language. While this is great on an individual level, it can have a steep learning curve. If you're working on a team with mixed backgrounds and experience levels, Dataiku can be a great tool to produce data insights at scale. Dataiku simultaneously allows Python fanboys like myself to integrate Python-based components into a data pipeline while simultaneously providing an accessible interface for business stakeholders to more easily control pieces of the flow and help further drive insights. There is a data visualization component of Dataiku that can allow you to quickly turn results from an experiment into an easily digestible dashboard that can be used to help make more business decisions. In this video, we saw some examples of what not to do when creating visualizations. The key takeaways from these examples are: avoid information overload, don't be misleading, and make your graphs easy to read. We then addressed techniques to turn a chart from one that is lacking into one that is insightful. Some of the techniques included stepping through your graph one component at a time, strategically using colors and opacity, and increasing your data to ink ratio. Creating great visualizations is very much a skill that can be honed in on with practice. I try to take inspiration and continue to learn from both the good and bad examples in my day-to-day life. One place that I frequent is the r/dataisbeautiful Reddit thread. It has all sorts of, fun examples and just really creative data visualizations that, I try to just learn little pieces and components on to apply into my own work. On the flip side of that, there's also a r/dataisugly Reddit thread, which I ended up actually taking a lot of the examples we walked through in this session from, and that can definitely be a helpful reminder of what to avoid. We are never going to be perfect with our data visualizations, but if you can keep making small improvements each day, it goes a long way. I hope you all enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to give it a big thumbs up, and also subscribe to the Recall by Dataiku channel to not miss any future videos on data analytics and related topics. Hope you all had a good time with this session. Until next time, peace out.